Welcome to Elevate Your Event, your favorite podcast for transforming fundraising events. Join us weekly for expert tips and creative ideas to make your next event a standout success.
On today's episode, we're diving into the critical topic that's often overlooked in fundraising events, accessibility. Join us as we sit down with Jeff Porter, the CEO and founder of Handbid, Stephanie Mason, our Director of Operations, and our special guest, Emma Ord, an esteemed accessibility specialist with event operations.
All right, well, welcome back to the Elevate Your Event podcast, where we talk about all the various ways you can make your next fundraising event better. And we have got a special guest today. We're excited to bring Emma on from Event Operations. So, Emma, tell us a little bit about your organization, and also tell us a little bit about, kind of how you got into event fundraising in the first place.
Yeah, so I set up Emma Ord Event Operations back at the end of 2022 after finishing with Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games. I've been working in the events industry for just over 16 years, working in a variation of roles for different organisations, majoritively music and sport. I've had dedicated accessibility roles, but also worked in marketing, ticketing, production, all those kind of roles. So with that knowledge, I can then better inform about accessibility best practice.
Okay, so you talk about accessibility. Let's define accessibility for our audience.
Yes.
So when you say, hey, I do accessibility, so what specifically are you helping your clients with?
People get very confused. The amount of LinkedIn requests I get about security cameras and access passes is ridiculous. And that's why every training session I do, I always start with this, because people get a little bit confused about it. In its purest form, it's disabled access. So that's visible, non-visible disabilities, providing facilities, services, process, procedure to make events more accessible and inclusive.
So you're saying you can't get me backstage to the Elton John concert?
I wish.
That's not the accessibility we're talking about. You're talking about people with disabilities of various types being able to access your event or whatever interface you're putting in front of them, right? Yeah.
That's correct, yeah.
Well, fantastic. So how did you get started in that?
It was a bit of a weird one, really. I used to work for Live Nation, one of their venues. I was a production assistant as part of my work experience at university, and they were recruiting for their summer roles for their Greenfield events. And I think I was the only person that applied for the overnight accessible campsite manager role. Oh. And I'm not surprised. It's not the most rock and roll role, is it? When you look at all the other ones where, it's like artist liaison, it's, stage and all this kind of stuff. So they gave me a call and they're like, would you like to come and be part of the team? And I was like, yes, I would love to. And I had a ball. I absolutely loved it. Became a more permanent role that I could apply for a couple of years later after doing a few years of volunteering. And fell in love with it, really. I didn't really know much about accessibility to that point, but I love live events and I love helping people. And it was great to see what you could do and what you could achieve and how everybody worked together. And it became a real passion from there, really.
Yeah, I think it's something that it's always there, and I guess you just need to be made aware of it, right? And then once you're kind of aware of it, it's like, wow, now I see issues everywhere, that should be fixed.
And still for me, working in this field day in, day out, especially with my role with Commonwealth Games, it was so broad. Every day there were different things where I was like, I'm in charge of that too. Oh, goodness me, I do need to think about that, because we had your traditional venues, but we also had athlete villages, we had training venues, there was so many, oh goodness, this does include me as well. And even I was surprised at some points how broad accessibility is. And of course it is. It's included in absolutely everything we do, our transport, our marketing, our policy and procedure, it's our accommodations, everything. You're like, wow, we need to wake up a little bit more and make sure that we are properly doing this.
It's funny because we had a child who was born with a disorder, and, in the very beginning, obviously when they're an infant, they're not necessarily telling you what all their issues are, but she definitely had some sensory issues. And so we started thinking about okay, so the people coming to our fundraisers who are either hearing impaired, visually impaired, colorblind at some level, or just have general sensory issues, maybe they don't like loud noises, how can you set up your event in a way that can accommodate them to the best of your ability, obviously. I mean, you're not going to make it to the point where it's like, hey, we're not going to have any live loud music just because we have people that might have sensory issues. We're just going to provide things for, to protect them. Maybe that's an indoor facility or headphones or something else that you can put on them. But it started to really, kind of become evident to us, as we started having people that were also coming with their children with the disorder, like, oh, wow, we got to really think about this, in terms of, how are we going to make our event, I would think safe. Like, I don't know if safe is the right word, but at least a comfortable place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For people to interact.
Absolutely. And I think there's been such a focus on like physical disability. People, when they think about accessibility, tend to go to like the stereotypical wheelchair user and ramp, assistance dog, where actually people are now beginning to wake up to conditions that are non-visible. And how can we help people more? I mean, especially in the UK, the increase in quiet rooms and such like. And as you say, kind of the headsets and what else can we do and how can technology be implemented? It's not just those old school stereotypical things that people are thinking of anymore. They're really thinking outside the box, which is brilliant too.
I think it's awesome. And it starts with like prior to the event. And so now most people are asking their customers or their guests or whatever you call them to register in advance on some sort of technology platform. So we do this in Handbid, right? So you're asking people to buy tickets online. And then you're trying to figure out, how do I communicate with these people and how to arrive? And have you thought about like not just, the physically disabled, like, how, are there handicap parking? Because in most of these venues there is, but then are there easy signage for if somebody was blind, how do they know how to get from the parking lot to the front door of your venue? Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of those things I think people kind of gloss over, but let's back up and talk about the technology for a second, because that has become something that obviously we as a technology company, Handbid, have had to really focus on and prioritize. And not just, definitely after COVID, when everybody moved online, it became definitely, I would say front and center. But even prior to that, we would go to these events, or we're doing events for, a blind organization or a deaf organization, and they're asking us these questions like, how does your software help with this? And we went to one event, and this one really opened my eyes. Their MC was blind. And he got up on stage and he wanted to demo to everybody how to bid donate in the Handbid app. And he went through there with the screen reader rolling, like scrolling through stuff. And I'm hearing things. I'm thinking, oh, we can make that better. Oh, we can make that better. Oh, we can make that sound clearer. Because you don't realize when you build these types of technology apps that people can visually see where they need to click, but if you've labeled that button wrong or something, the screen reader's reading to this person what the button says, and they're like, oh yeah, that button probably shouldn't say that.
Yeah.
So a lot of those things really did kind of become front and center for us. And, obviously we felt really good when he scrolled all the way over to the donation items and made a donation and showed everybody how easy it was. And we were, not prepared for that, I'll be honest, but obviously pleasantly surprised that it worked well. But we went back internally and said, we want this to be easy. And I don't know how many technology companies do that. And I'll also say, I don't know how many of, charities and organizations ask about that. Obviously, Emma, you're making them aware of that, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're working with clients, it's very much auditing what they do already and suggesting these things. Like, kudos to you guys. That's fantastic that you saw what was happening. Like, oh, okay, we weren't aware of all this, but how can we then make it better? That's so, so important, because this keeps on evolving and changing and we can't stand still. So that's brilliant that Handbid have done that, because you could have gone like, brilliant, great, it works, kind of, let's get in that. That's fantastic to review it. But yeah, it's about that all the time, talking to people, making them aware that technology exists. And again, there's new fantastic technology that's being launched all the time. I don't necessarily know that everything that's out there, because it keeps on changing. And how exciting is that? Because the possibilities are kind of endless, aren't they? If we can keep on developing it, it's so, so exciting.
It really is. And so obviously with COVID, this became front and center for a lot of our clients, especially our larger university organizations who were like, from a legal standpoint, we have a lot of liability here, and so we want to make sure that the tools that we're using are compliant. I remember we had just brought on a brand new developer who was working on our front end website, and her first project, she said, "Okay, what's my first project?" I said, "You need to make our, front facing bidder website fully screen reader compliant. Like we've hired a consulting company. They've come through. They've given me the list of things you got to go fix. Some of these are visual, right? If it's size of fonts or contrast ratios and all that other kind of stuff. We'll come back to design in a second. But the rest of it, honestly, is I want you to put a screen reader on this thing, and I want you to use a keyboard, and I want you to navigate our entire site with a keyboard and a screen reader. And it was a little bit of a challenge at first. I mean, I remember the first couple of weeks we were working with her on it, and finally she got it. I mean, it was like something clicked where she's like, I'm going to be able to navigate and do everything I possibly can with a keyboard. And I was like, perfect.
That's awesome.
That's exactly what we want.
Challenge.
And it is a challenge, though. I will say, I mean, it's one of those things where if you haven't designed your technology with some of those things in mind, retroing them back in there is not always the easiest thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's so important. That's why accessibility needs to be embedded from the very, very beginning, because otherwise it's such a pain to add it back in. It's really hard work. And if we can develop it from the first thing and it's always part of our thinking, it makes it easier. It's still a challenge. It's still hard, but everybody's on that journey with you then. So it's not one web developer battling through, trying to make changes. Everybody's thinking every page, every link, every button, right, how do we do this? How do we make this work together?
Yeah, for sure. And, that goes back to the design element, because a lot of times when you're in a technology world, you start with maybe wireframes or a design of how you want your app or your site to look. And the designers don't always have, contrast ratios and all those things in mind. So they're like, we're going to take your brand and we're just going to literally we're going to make this site look amazing. And then you're looking at light gray text on a white background and you're like, okay, so my eyes are still good enough. I can see that. But if I put my mother-in-law in front of this screen, her eyes aren't that great anymore. This font is too small. She can't read it. I mean, you should see the size of the font in her texting app on her iPhone, right? But I mean, that's the stuff we're talking about. And so I remember we would constantly be going back to our designer and saying, you got to fix these things, and it's harder, when you don't start with that, because you're constantly
and it can still look good. That's the thing. Like, if we can design it in from the beginning, it can still look really, really great. It can still be really impactful, and that's what we want. We don't want to spoil, wreck everybody's fun. We want it to be really good, but it has to be functional, because if it's not, what's the point? Nobody can use our site. No one can donate. Nobody can interact. They can't find out the information they need. So what a pointless exercise building the website or whatever we're doing in the first place, because no one can use it. So the functionality is so key. And I mean, I use the contrast checker quite a lot to check what I've done, because you sometimes need to. Sometimes you're like, that should work, and it absolutely doesn't work.
Right.
I agree. We have plugins now, and it's funny. We work directly with a third party who's a constant consultant to us on accessibility, and they have a really cool plugin that goes into the browser that our developers use, that is constantly giving them feedback on what the plugin finds compliant and what it doesn't. So they can make those adjustments on the fly, and you're not waiting until the end. I think a lot of companies do that. They design a site, they build it, they publish it, then they hire some third party to come back and ask them if it's compliant, and they come back and say, all of these things are not compliant, which you could have fixed in the beginning, had you kind of taken this thing, some of these, principles in mind. And there's lots of principles, right? I mean, there's lots of things out there, these best practices we talk about, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of design or even in terms of implementation, that I think every technology company should be focused on, right? Stuff like size of fonts, or what's a contrast ratio? Everybody's probably thinking on our audience right now what a contrast ratio is. But it's the ratio of the color of the font against the background, and when there's not a big difference in those, I'm going to try to make this as layman as possible. When there's not a big difference in those, people that are hearing. It's a great day. People that are visually impaired have a hard time seeing those. I mean, I like to talk about the green font on the red background example.
Yeah.
Which I know we have custom theming, Emma, and it's funny because part of it's like, why'd you take so long in Handbid to allow your clients to completely customize the look and feel of the landing page? I was like, largely because of this. Because because they're going to ruin it. I mean, not all. Hey, some of our clients out there have beautiful looking sites, but either way, I mean, some of the times that's the challenge. They create these color combinations that shouldn't ever go together.
Correct.
Yeah. I used a really exciting tool during Commonwealth Games that we added to our website. It was like an accessibility toolbar, and the user can change the site based on their own individual preferences. So they can change the colorway, the font size, it can read aloud, it can change the language. It was a really cool piece of tech.
Yeah.
And actually, I was like, this is fantastic, because obviously the web developer has a job to do. I'm not clever to know all the ins and outs of that behind the scenes. Right. I was like, how brilliant that somebody can go on and be like, right, this is what I need. This is what I want. This is how I build it. You can save it. So when you go back to the site, it's like that. And I'd not really seen much like that before, but the kind of the breadth of what you could do with it was brilliant. And because I don't know, everybody's requirements are individual and they may change slightly from day to day, where actually that colorway doesn't work today, or actually today I need it to read aloud to me, or the font size needs to be a little bit bigger because it's the end of the day. And actually in the end of the day, I find a larger font size better. It was really cool to be able to do that.
I agree. And we actually have a plugin just like that on our website that is for the end users. Okay. And it's neat. Like, now we didn't decide to stop there. And I'll tell you why, because if I'm coming to the site and I'm blind, I'm not finding that plugin anyway, unless that site is inherently accessible to begin with a screen reader. So we wanted to make sure that, like, from a base level, everything was in place, and so from there, like, people come to the site and then it actually now will tell them there's an accessibility tool here. And so it does everything you're describing. You want it to inverse the contrast ratio. I think there's one in there for, like, attention deficit disorder, and it, like, darkens the entire page except for a little sliver of, like, brightness, like, on the spot where the person's looking. I mean, really cool stuff.
I think that's an important point, though, that, not just one tool, as amazing as it is, that's just not your solution. You can't still just, not address accessibility because you think I'm just going to slap this tool on here and all my problems are solved. Like, it really is, coming at it from different angles.
Yep.
And so, I mean, I can't think of a better word in this moment, but, like, it's not something you can be lazy about, essentially. You've got to think about it from all different ways and just, not just leave it at
no shortcuts.
This one solution. Yeah,
right?
No shortcuts.
No shortcuts. And here's the other thing, because this came up a lot, over the years with Handbid, like, why would you build an app? And we've had lots of podcasts describing the benefits of an app, but this is also one of them for our readers to understand, because this is also one of them for our listeners to understand, because, in this case, people will go onto their phone and they'll put in all of these accessibility adjustments on their phone. They can increase the contrast, they can increase the font size. Well, all of that spills into our app, okay? Where it doesn't on the web. If I open up a web page, if that web page is not accessibility compliant, it, like, that kind of stuff gets lost. Mm-hmm. Now, I would say sometimes you can really destroy the user interface of an app when your font size is 2 pixels high on an iPhone. But either way, I mean, it definitely gives people a more comfortable environment, and look, I have larger font on my phone, right? And so for me, it's nice when I go into certain apps like Handbid where I'm not having to, like, squint at the phone because they've chosen fonts that are so small inside of that app. So that's nice.
Yeah. So kind of moving beyond technology, how do you start when you're meeting with somebody who's doing an in-person event? Like, how do you lead them through that process of thinking about accessibility?
It has to be from the very, very beginning. What is that first touch point? And usually that is information driven. It's people coming to the website. It's people reading about an event on social media. It can be print as well. Let's not forget the non-digital versions, but people are having to get information about something first to find out about it. So how is that accessible? So we start from that very first touch point and every single one all the way through. So we kind of map that journey out. Where possible, I'll go to an event prior to the one that we're going to make some changes to kind of test run it really and see how it actually works in practice. But it's from that very first touch point for an attendee.
That makes sense. And, so from the point that they arrive, they walk in through the door, how do they know where to go? To your point about a program, Is that something that, if I'm visually impaired, like what is my option there? And then we were talking about the presentation itself.
Yes.
We've been to so many events where the presentation has no captions. Like, this is your highly invested in tearjerker, you need to donate now video. And the people who can't hear are in the audience and there's no captions on the video.
Yeah, and it's a significant number of people that are in the room that are hard of hearing. Like, statistically, it's way more than you would expect, especially, depending on the demographic of your crowd,
Well, since all of our clients like to tell us how old their bidders are.
Yes.
Our guests are so old, they're not going to use technology. Well, they're not hearing your video apparently either.
Yes.
Let's think about even wider for captions. It might be like, I'm dyslexic, so actually I prefer to follow that sometimes along with hearing to make sure I've got it right, or is that the right word, or what are we actually on about? Or if we have guests that's not their native language in the audience too, to follow along, because otherwise what a shame. We're going to miss people donating and bidding, and you've lost them straight away because do you know what? You don't care about me. So do you know what? I'm done now. Thank you. And that's the point from the information to begin with, that first touch point. If we lose them there, they're gone. They don't care. They're like, this isn't for me. But especially with those hard-hitting bits where we're trying to get people in, that's the main crux of our events.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. And I didn't even think about that, but I 100% agree with you. It doesn't even have to be that they're massively hearing impaired. They could just be, ADD or dyslexic or something else. I mean, I'll tell you, I'll be super vulnerable here. I like the subtitles on the TV when I'm watching stuff at home these days.
Me too.
How many of us do that though, right? On Netflix, I always have the subtitles on. It's easy to follow along. It makes me make sure I'm watching and not scrolling on my phone at the same time as well.
I know. Especially, especially when you watch certain types of shows where they talk so fast and you're trying to figure out what did they just say. You either rewind or you just put the subtitles up. So I think that's always things where sometimes we think, hey, you know what? I need to worry about the people that have some sort of major impairment. Sure, you do. But just think about the little crutches you can give people, around where you put your trash cans. I mean, I saw a guy at an event who was just walking with a cane, but my God, he had to walk halfway across the room just to throw his drink away.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times it's what are the traffic patterns? Where do people walk? What types of little teeny adjustments can I make that'll just make all of them a little bit more comfortable?
Space between tables.
Yes.
Just walking through the tables. Sometimes these venues they're so packed. I mean, is that really accessible?
Right.
If somebody has a cane or
a wheelchair?
Definitely not a wheelchair. You can't even get through there.
Right.
With the cane.
Can you actually get through the venue door sometimes, right?
Yeah.
That's where, for a lot of the work that I do as well, you start at that point if we're just doing a venue audit. Because if we can't get through the front door, I'm not going to go and audit the rest of the venue. What's the point?
Where's Emma? Emma never showed up to our event. Oh, she came. She just never walked in the front door.
And that's it. And often we'll get there, we'll get a bit excited and ahead of ourselves and be like, right, let's get into the venue. Let's look at the seating. Let's look at this. It's if we can't get in, we've got a major problem.
That's
here.
a great point.
I did this event in Nashville. And I remember, I'm not going to name the charity, but all I know is I show up at this thing and it's a really neat kind of old church venue, whatever. And you walk in the door and there's this little teeny foyer, okay? And they had check-in there. And I said, okay, well, how do we get to the event? And they're like, go that way. I look and there's got to be 40 steps straight up. And I was like, what? Yeah. I said, is there an elevator? Oh, there's an elevator around the corner. It's kind of a servicey type elevator, but guests that don't want to walk the stairs can take that. Well, I'll tell you who was ready to be carried out in a wheelchair that night was me, right? I mean, I went up and down those stairs about 40 times that night. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, these poor guests, right? And it's not even can my mother-in-law make it up 40 steps? Yes. Can she do it 2 or 3 times? Not, I wouldn't want her to. So I think it's also just important to make sure that when you're thinking about these things, it's not oh yeah, they can make it up there. It's can they really do this for an entire event? Whatever
and
it
just
is you're
injured
asking
people.
to do.
I mean,
I know, I'm injured.
Just injured people,
Right.
even,
One of my favourite ones was we were reviewing some accommodation options, and I was like, oh, I was told there's some accessible rooms in this building. So we went through, did the route. I was like, right, how would you get through? It's the lift access. Yeah, there's a lift. There were 5 steps down to the lift. I don't know who designed that building. I'm like, we're not going up there. We're crossing the next off our list. This doesn't work. But it is, it's baffling. So people are like, yeah, it's accessible, it's fine. And you're like, no, it's not. So yeah, it's kind of taking a step back sometimes, quite literally, and going like, right, okay, where are we coming from? Where are we going to?
I know.
How does this work?
There's a
crazy.
place in Denver, and they wanted to do an event here, and they ended up, this one charity decided not to, but it had this really cool elevator in the middle, and the elevator was really old fashioned. Okay. And I was like, that is really neat. That's going to be really cool. Well, when you got in, you had to crank the door shut.
Oh wow.
And I was like, come on, you guys, unless you're going to have a volunteer sitting here doing this all night long, you cannot send your guests up and down this elevator. Like, oh yeah, you're probably right.
So I have another question for you, Emma. Like, obviously, you're guiding your clients to have their own awareness and start thinking about accessibility on their own. But do you also do you advise them to ask their guests, like maybe as part of their ticketing process? Are there any accommodations that you would need? What is your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Some people will cringe a little bit and go, oh, we can't ask questions, we can't do this. But you absolutely can, provided you're asking the questions in the right way, in a respectful way, and the information you're asking for is for a purpose. That's absolutely fine. It's really, really important. I've used it on a lot of events, and I advise it now because we can get a better idea of what our attendees' requirements are and what we need to provide. It might be that we need to increase resources. It may be that we decrease resource in some cases. It might be that somebody has a requirement where actually we need to think a little bit differently about their journey to us or the information we need to provide to them. It's usually for ticketed, seated events that I've done a lot of work for in the past. So it's, if somebody has a visual impairment, it may be that we seat them closer to, in a sporting arena, the field of play. Or if they have a hearing impairment, is it where the sign language or interpreter is positioned that we need to seat them? If they're bringing an assistance dog, typically I'd advise that they sit in the wheelchair bay because it's then more dignified and there's a bit more space for both the assistance dog owner and the assistance dog. What else? Like easy access seating. So seating maybe up or down a couple of steps. That might be for hidden disabilities. Maybe somebody that this finds the crowd a little bit overwhelming, that needs to be at the end of an aisle or separate, but they can still sit in the general seating area. So there's all those kind of considerations. Even then we can ask questions about accessible parking and things like that as well, to get a more rounded view of what we need and then better equip ourselves for planning.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. I've heard people sort of have arguments for both sides. I think there's maybe a little bit of fear around asking or the right way to ask. So that's why I was curious.
Is there ever a time when you have to say no?
It depends what it's for, really. I did a training session this morning, actually, and that was one of the questions that was asked, kind of when can you say no? Again, it depends what that request is. There was an example this morning about the entrance had been made, it'd been planned in an accessible way, there were accessible search lanes, but there'd been a request for there to be a separate accessible entrance from an attendee. And they were like, well, can we say no? And I was like, you can, provided that you show you're working out and go, we have done this is what we've planned, this is why. So actually, we won't be doing that for this reason. So providing we can show why we are saying no, that is okay within reason. Obviously, we're not going to just dismiss any accessible requests and go, no, we're not making any adjustments, we're doing this. But if you've done planning and there's a reason why, that is okay as well.
Because I see the airline starting to do a little bit of that. I mean, there's a friend of mine, she's a professor at a college, and one of her students has a comfort snake and brings it to class. And so, Emma, I have to ask, I'll put you on the spot. So if I want to bring my comfort snake to your event, am I going to be allowed to bring it?
Do you know what? For Commonwealth Games, we obviously, like, a lot of our staff are from different parts of the world, and I was working with an American guy that asked me that question. Yeah. Well, what about if it's an assistance pony? What about if it's this? And I was like, oh, wow, in the UK, I'm not used to this. This is blew my mind.
Okay.
But, and based on that, we then wrote policy and procedure around. So usually we have assistance dogs in the UK.
Yes.
And there's certain, there's accredited assistance dogs because it's a really difficult area sometimes. How do you say no to somebody? So we kind of worked with some of the major charities and organisations that do the accreditation of that to get guidance and then write policy. So people were more confident if somebody did appeal with something going, I'm really sorry, we asked you to inform us beforehand so we could have that conversation, not at the front gate, but also knew our stance. But yeah, I think that's going to become more prevalent. It's already not an issue, but there's confusion about when it's not a guide dog. Actually, what are these animals and are they actually for a purpose? Because unfortunately, we do have people that take the mickey. I don't know if that's like an American phrase as well that it translates. They take advantage of the situation. Like actually,
I'm going to start using that one. Take the mickey. Yes. I've been to Disney and seen a lot of people take the mickey, so I completely understand what you're saying. So it's look, I mean, and it's serious and it's it's kind of funny at all the same time. But I mean, this can be tough for an organization because for us, like. I'll tell you, if my daughter's at that event, she has a massive fear of snakes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you got to be careful about, look, I'm going to accommodate one person and maybe create another issue for another. And so I do think, there's got to be a little bit of line. And you're right. I mean, in most cases, I mean, there's kind of, I don't call it the norm, but just kind of the standard track and service dogs are definitely very common. Right, compared to other types of accommodations that people want. So I think you just want, all of our listeners to understand that you don't have to say yes to everything, right? You've got to make your event accommodation for what the vast majority. And I think, the outliers, maybe it's best they do it online. That's what technology is for sometimes. Hey, look, if the event is not going to accommodate you, we're going to do our best. But, if we can't get to some place that's going to be comfortable for you, then we'd love for you to join us online, and we'll live stream the event virtually for you, and you can see it and participate and all that other kind of great stuff.
In terms of assistance animals, I think that's where it's fantastic that we can ask questions beforehand because we don't need to say an assistance dog. We can get that information beforehand and have some of those delicate conversations and see if it's appropriate. And if it is, maybe you're right, we're going to seat you here or we're going to do this because we need to be considerate of our other guests. But yeah, absolutely. So that we can't be everything to everyone and we can't be scared of saying that sometimes. I see a lot of organisations where they try and do everything, but they do everything not 100% and not great. So everything's really bad across the board. And you just concentrate on doing one thing brilliantly and then let's go on to the next project. So nail your accessible ticketing first or your accessible marketing and then we can look at the next step.
I like that. Like kind of doing this in stages, right? Don't bite off more than you can chew. Like make gradual progress over the years.
Yeah.
And providing we're transparent, that's absolutely fine because we have to keep on developing and evolving what we're doing anyway. So just be honest with people so they can make then, as you were saying, an informed decision. Actually, this event isn't appropriate for me right now. This is an alternative way I can be involved, or it's giving disabled people that opportunity to make their own decision about an event.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The other thing in my past life, I worked for a company who we have a technology product for deaf and hard of hearing people. And we were selling to all different kinds of people, but a lot of nonprofits, a lot of schools and universities, churches, things like that. And there was always a pushback about cost, right? And I think one of the things that I have noticed in working in that space, that if you're asking questions for your event and then you realize there's a specific tool or accommodation that there's a cost associated, a lot of times if you let your sponsors know, like there's an opportunity to sponsor the sign language interpreter, people will jump on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, your sponsors will jump on that. You just got to let them know, though, that there's an opportunity. And yeah, especially, corporate sponsors, they really want to be associated with providing solutions for everybody. So it's a good.
That's great because not everybody's going to want to sponsor the alcohol,
correct,
or the food. But I think this is kind of a corporate good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. That's a great point. And so I think
100%.
yeah. And so I think for anybody out there, if you're feeling like, hey, maybe we should explore some of these things because, an ASL, licensed interpreter is not free.
Nope.
That might be the way to do it, but there are some things that may not cost you anything extra. If you're already working with a video provider, just say to them like, hey, we need to caption this.
Yep.
How do we do that? And I think in a lot of cases, it's not going to be considerably more money to do that after they're done. So I think there's tools that do that anyway. So
yes.
Anyway, well, this has been a great conversation. I think for me, at least, been super educational and just kind of thinking about all the different areas of the event from the beginning to the end and getting people out the door at the end of the night and getting their auction items to the car and all the things you have to think about, especially for people who are impaired. Some of them are like permanently impaired and some of them are probably temporarily impaired. But either way, help them to their cars for sure, and just think about these things. And Emma, for you, like, what parting advice you have for any of our listeners who are planning their next event to think about as it relates to accessibility?
Yeah. So don't forget your different client groups would be a key one. So think about your attendees, but don't forget your workforce, your volunteers, everybody involved in that event. Their requirements are really important too, because without those people behind the scenes, your event's not going to happen. It's going to be a bit rubbish. So think about everybody. Provide as much information as you possibly can. It might feel silly to talk about the terrain. It might feel silly to say that it's an indoor venue, and it's obvious it's an indoor venue, but these little bits of information can really build the picture for somebody to decide whether an event's for them. As we said, try not to accomplish too much in one go. Pick your little projects one at a time and nail them. Go for it. And don't be so worried to say no. Have confidence. Do accessibility awareness training. Build your knowledge. And you can't go wrong then.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for just imparting all of your wisdom with our audience here. It's been great. And so we wish all of you the best of luck at your next event. And we also encourage all of you to dig into, how you can make your next event more accessible than it is today. And so until then, we're going to wrap this one up. Happy fundraising, everyone.
Thank you for tuning into this insightful episode where we delve deep into the crucial topic of accessibility. A special thank you to Emma Ord, the esteemed accessibility specialist with Events Operations. If you enjoyed our show, please take a moment to leave us a review. You can find us on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Don't forget to subscribe for more great content. And if you're a fan of video, check us out on YouTube. Until next time, happy fundraising.